our inaugural Pride Talk. This came about last year as a result of our diversity and inclusion plan, and thinking about ways that we can engage the campus community on meaningful dialogues on issues of diversity and inclusion. We've got really, I think, a 7-part series coming up, but this is the first of our fall workshops. But before I present our fall speaker, I want to highlight some of the other speakers that are going to occur. So on Tuesday, October 16th, we're going to have a session, where you get old, you got to go up with the glasses, on daring discussions in difficult times, stepping into critical and messy and brave dialogues. On Tuesday, November 13th, we're going to try something a little bit different. We've got our campus director from Houston. So what we're going to do is, using our Zoom technology, he is going to be presenting from Houston to our regional campuses with us. So I hope that you all can come back to that on that date, Tuesday, November 13th, where Eric will be talking about race and place in the ivory tower, justice and action in higher education. Then to wind down our fall, we've got our very own Dr. Nina Asaki, who's in the back. Nina, hello.
Hello.
From the School of Social Work. And she's going to be talking to us about delivering organizational trust and justice. So as you can see, this is a dynamic workshop. We may be similar to what some of you all are familiar with in terms of the TED Talk series. So these are meant to be 15 to 20-minute talks with opportunities for dialogue and Q&A. We've got plenty of seats up front, so come on forward. But this morning, we've got Professor of Psychology, Michael Cadaret. He's going to be talking to us about ending the cycle of toxic masculinity. You may recall last year we had several dialogues and several talks on masculinity around campus. So this is taking that conversation forward. So Michael, without further ado, I will pass it over to you. Thank you so much for being our inaugural Pride Talk speaker. He's going to set the bar for all of our future speakers, so please give him a warm welcome.
So I'd like to start this talk with a question. And whether your response comes from a conscious or unconscious reaction, you've likely answered this question many times before. So I invite you to answer it silently in your mind. You maybe even close your eyes and visualize your response. So you ready? What does it mean to be a man? Let me throw in a modifier. What does it mean to be a real man? Chances are many different images, ideas, adjectives, and descriptions come to mind. We each create frameworks for organizing our social expectations, our relationships to one another. It is likely that as a result, you have a solid mental representation of a real man. Now, what if I told you how you answer this question could predict how complicit you might be with accepting violence, especially violence against women, or how likely you might be to accept and condone rape myths, or even blame victims of sexual assault? Seems like there'd be a lot more riding on your answer then. But first, let's return to the question. What does it mean to be a real man? This is a question that many young people ask themselves. Certainly as a cisgendered male, it was something I asked myself. Growing up, this question became increasingly relevant as I entered high school. As a 15-year-old kid, I wore long hair, had a bad complexion, had polyester shirts with butterfly collars and flowers printed on them. Sometimes wore barrettes in my shaggy hair. I listened to and wrote love songs. I liked art. I was anxious and awkward. Pretty much just the way an adolescent should be. But I also had to endure the name-calling, the taunts, threats of violence for the way I looked. I had a deep sense of wanting to belong and to be liked. Now, I might not have explicitly asked myself, how do I become a man? But it was peers that I looked to, movies, TVs, music videos. This is the heyday of MTV. And in less than a year's time, I'd cut my hair, changed my fashion choices, started partying and hanging out with guys that I thought fit the image of real men. As I transitioned to college, this image became more entrenched. I read Maxim and Men's Health for tips on grooming, fashion, and other how-tos of the masculine catalog. I spent hours in the gym, hoping that I might will myself to resemble Brad Pitt in Fight Club. And although I longed for close relationships, I took an air of indifference, especially towards romantic interests. I drank a lot. I took risks that now make me cringe with regret and embarrassment. I learned not to back down in the fight, to never let somebody disrespect you, to cut someone down by revealing they were weak, effeminate, or gay. I was overly competitive with other men, especially in front of women and often about the silliest things. My relationship tendencies, in retrospect, skewed toward being possessive and insecure. My socialization into toxic masculinity was gradual. In fact, it started long before I began high school. It was a culmination of the expectations passed down to me by my father, my brother, neighborhood kids, what I saw at school, what I imitated on TV. It was the dominant message. This is what it means to be a man. Toxic masculinity has received increased attention in the past few years. Certainly, the Me Too movement has shined light on the brazen nature of men who hold positions of power. When the conversation turns from the individual to the collective, it has been followed by a backlash from some media columnists and radio personalities who believe this is an attack on masculinity itself. What they fail to recognize is that toxic masculinity is just one form of masculinity. But they are right to be confused. Toxic masculinity dominates the depictions of maleness and overrepresents the image of masculinity in movies, popular entertainment, such as sports and the WWE, and is a top seller in men's lifestyle media, such as Maxim, Esquire, and FX. And though widely accepted and highly visible as what a man is, this form of masculinity, represented by emotional restriction, domination over women, heterosexual self-presentation, competitiveness, risk-taking, violence, and self-reliance, causes real harm. In my own story, my internalized sense of what it meant to be a man separated me from a true sense of myself, from a real sense of confidence, from true intimacy and honest relationships. It also did physical damage. Drinking, drug use, and fights have left scars, both emotional and physical, that I still carry with me. Research has shown that masculinity, typified by the above categories, indeed results in greater substance use and abuse, higher levels of aggression, dangerous risk-taking, higher blood pressure, higher rates of depression, and anxiety. And while these men are more troubled, they are less likely to seek help from a mental health professional or even from a physician. A loss of control is viewed as weakness, and men who endorse this form of masculinity also have strain in their romantic, marital, and family relationships. They are more likely to disparage women and sexual minorities. They are less likely to express emotions, and even less likely to engage in their relationship with their kids. As a result, men who endorse toxic masculine behaviors as the norm are less satisfied with their lives in general. See, toxic masculinity isn't just a phrase that we throw around. It's a socialized experience that not only hurts our society, but hurts the very men who perpetuate toxic masculine behaviors. Now, while you may say to yourself, this is not the masculinity I embody or endorse, I'm more than certain that you can recognize it. I would venture to guess that walking the residence halls of our undergraduate institution, if you peered into a student room, you might see on the wall an image of Tony Montana, brandishing an AR-15 with the quote, "Say hello to my little friend." For those of you who obfuscate the acceptance of toxic masculinity, the celebration of this image from the movie Scarface represents a disconnect. We revere the stories of male gangsters without taking into account the repercussions, the cost, and eventual downfall of these individuals. Thus, as a young man, you may not be involved in nefarious activities, but by our cultural expectation that this form of masculinity should be celebrated and revered, we grant it supreme status when defining true masculinity. That is because this form of masculinity is assumed to be normal. It is legitimized and even celebrated in multiple spheres of social influence. As a cultural expectation, it is the yardstick by which we compare our men, ourselves, and the lens through which we define gender relations. Sociologist and masculinity researcher Robert W. Cannell describes this toxic masculinity as hegemonic masculinity. That is a normative and honored way of being a man, by which other men position themselves in relation to, and that which ideologically legitimates the subordination of women and other marginalized identities to men. He states that, quote, hegemonic masculinities can be constructed that do not correspond closely to the lives of actual men. Yet these models do express widespread ideals, fantasies, and desires. They provide models of relation with women and solutions to problems of gender relations. Insight into this power hierarchy can be illuminated by a term from masculinity research, precarious manhood. By definition, precarious manhood means that status and recognition as a man is earned. It's socially brokered and endorsed by other men. When this earned status is threatened, men often make compensatory efforts to reclaim their masculinity, often by reasserting themselves, often in ways that are in line with the toxic masculine behaviors outlined before. Our Gender Justice Research Lab has hypothesized this is because when men lack masculine representations, their mental response to the question, what does it mean to be a man, is flooded with the cultural and social expectations that form a depiction of masculinity that is restricted to the dominant ideological form of the toxic male. So how do we change these expectations? In other words, how do we change the culture around the definition of what is masculine? I began to ask this question as I engaged in work that concerned sexual assault prevention on college campuses. I observed in the classroom that when we discussed the presence of rape culture on college campuses, often women and some men could readily identify and affirm their experiences. In essence, our programming wasn't telling them anything new. It was giving them a space to process and vocalize experiences that had otherwise been previously silenced. For many of the men in the room, when we had our breakout sessions and discussed the content of our bystander prevention programming, it appeared this was the first time they were hearing many of these stories. Up to that point, many men believed the dominant narrative they had been sold, especially surrounding masculinity, men's behaviors in heterosexual relationships. That it was not only their male friends' expectations for behavior, but also their female peers. Thus, men in our groups really needed another group, a group to process how they had been duped, into believing that the yardstick that they were using to measure their masculinity was a falsehood. That, in fact, by being complicit in condoning this form of masculinity, they'd actually been hurting people, especially women. Still, all expressions of gender are socialized into the same dominant definition. And our collective endorsement, how we answer that first question, what does it mean to be a man, molds a culture that places restrictions on young boys and girls. By allowing toxic masculinity to be the socialized ideal, when we define femininity in juxtaposition to these masculine characteristics. In short, we create a gender dichotomy that only serves to essentialize the expression of gender and restricts everyone's self-expression. In a study we completed last spring at this institution, we surveyed 120 undergraduate students on their endorsement of traditional male gender norms. Questions like, on a scale from 1 to 4, how much do you agree with the following statement? Most men believe that things tend to be better when men are in charge. Or, if they could, most men would frequently change sexual partners, along with other questions consistent with those categories mentioned previously. What we found was that when participants endorsed male gender norms, they were also more likely to endorse traditional female gender norms, such as agreement with statements like, most women believe having romantic relationships is essential in life. Moreover, higher endorsement of male gender roles was associated with personal acceptance of violence, hostile sexism, benevolent sexism, hostility towards women, and to a lesser extent, adversarial sexual beliefs. 78% of our sample identified as women, and only 22% identified as men. Thus, toxic masculinity is not only men endorsing these behaviors, but also women. These views of how men should behave define women in opposing terms: dominant versus subservient, casual sex versus committed relationship, career versus domestic duties. As long as we sustain male gender role norms as cultural expectations, we bifurcate gender and ultimately limit all expressions of gender identity. The title of this talk is Ending the Cycle of Toxic Masculinity. So far, I've only highlighted the need to do so. So let me spend my last few minutes outlining what we need to end toxic masculinity in our communities. First, we need to create safe spaces to process and discuss gender expectations and challenge their hold on our self-concept, our self-esteem, and relationship to one another. Whether in the classroom, the residence hall, the community center, the coffee shop, the barber shop, or the locker room, male relationships need to recalibrate their posturing and positioning. And instead, be open to exploration, questioning, expanding their views of maleness, and creating more accepting spaces that aren't built on fear of exclusion, but rather on the spirit of inclusion. This may be a lofty aim, but it begins with a conversation, with an invitation. Second, we need representation. When boys look to find role models and images of masculinity, there needs to be a variety of individuals that uphold a masculinity that can embody strength and vulnerability, power through integrity and caring for and about others, sexuality that is consensual, respectful, and relationships that are equal and empowering. My guess is that we know men like this in our lives. The problem is that what we know and what dominates our perceptions are given disproportionate assessment of value. So now I want to end with a question. Can you bring to mind a man that represents these strengths? Picture them in your mind. If we are inundated with expressions and representations that form a mental picture of what it is to be a man that is steeped in toxic masculine images, we must reprogram our default mode of representation. Instead, in the moment I ask what it means to be a man, think of the person who is caring, respectful, treats others equally, is able to be vulnerable, admits mistakes, responds with patience. When I ask what it means to be a real man, I hope this is what we demand of our leaders, of our media, and of one another. Thank you.
We've got time for questions. We've got about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A. So do we have any questions for Dr. Conrad? Not all at once. I like Mary Beth yesterday.
All right, I'll say something.
Can you introduce yourself?
Linda Marston, Director of Grants and Sponsored Research.
Hi, Linda.
All right, I might propose that one solution is asking ourselves the question, how do we be a better human being?
Mm-hmm.
And asking that, and then if a gender expectation is contrary to that, maybe that's what we need to focus on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, I think that that's often, when people talk about in media and things come up about men's behavior, and then people say, this is how they should be behaving, people, well, that's just a decent human being, right? That's how people should behave. And I think we can all agree with that. But I think when we start with, as that is an expectation, what it does is it kind of obscures or looks over the fact that we are socialized into gender expectations, that is part of what we're brought up with, what media enforces on us and reinforces in different images and depictions. And so while we can say that, I think that we need to kind of not think about the flowers that we want in this plant, but think about the soil in which these plants are growing, right? And so if we talk about the end result of what we want to see, but don't think about how we root out a lot of the negativity and bad depictions of maleness and gendered behavior, then we're not really going to the cause of the problem. And I think, I agree with you, right? I think in the things that I listed, as far as what I would come up with is what we want to demand from people, that those are the outcomes that we want to see. But I think we need to kind of also what we call in some of the groups that we run would be like critical consciousness. Bring critical consciousness to people's socialized experiences so that they can think, okay, yeah, like this is why I've been doing this is why I've been behaving this way. I need to be able to reflect on who I am in order to then make choices that would be more aligned in these values.
Okay. Oh, thank you. I'm sorry. Thank you, Matt. That was phenomenally informative. You did set the bottom, kind of hot for the rest of us. But in any event, I was curious in terms of what's going on now.
Yeah.
You know, with regards to the Kavanaugh appointment, and it seems like toxic masculinity is on steroids right now in our society, and
Yeah.
at least in the political system.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, and this is such a change from Obama, President Obama, who, at least for me personally, represented,
Yeah.
you know, respect for women, respect for others. And I just don't know if it's kind of like a collective kind of, because of our president, perhaps, a collective, like not all of the politicians are toxic kind of males, but I'm just curious in terms of what your take on that right now.
Right. I don't know. I think that there's this, for survivors of domestic violence, there's this really great program in Denver called the Women's Bean Project. And so a lot of times women feel trapped in relationships because they don't have financial freedom. And so this helps them establish that. And there's a woman who went through this program and then became a lawyer and wrote this book called The Third Law. And so we all know Newton's third law, which is for every reaction, there's an equal and opposite reaction. And so I feel as though maybe the election of someone who has multiple allegations of sexual assault and sexual violence, who speaks gendered language and performs in ways that are certainly in line with toxic male behaviors, that if there isn't this equal and opposite reaction. And I think the more that we as feminists push, against that, the more there's going to be kind of an opposite reaction into that, because that requires change. I even think with somebody like Brett Kavanaugh, and a lot of the things that in the commentary on it mirror the things that we hear from, there was a athlete in East Longmeadow that was convicted of sexual violence. Where when I started this programming in the community near where I was Steubenville, and there were two male football players who were in their senior year who had videotaped, sexually violating a young woman. And when they were convicted, a lot of people, their future. Think about, all their potential, the things that they have. And people say the same now about Kavanaugh. Well, this happened, 30 years ago. So why should it matter now? And I think that it does. I think that what it does is it says that this is the standard, which we've set a bar, and it's not okay. And so that sends the message to young men. You can't just do whatever you want and then become a Supreme Court justice 30 years later. And he might have lived an upstanding life since then, but I think we need to say, this isn't okay. And I think we need to do that, and we'll maybe do that in this referendum on this presidency and see what that looks like as well. But I think that that's people's reactions in a lot of ways. Mike?
Mike Surratt, psychology. Not my question, just I have a question, but he suggested he's not done anything. So first, let's not suggest he has, because he's saying he did.
Mm-hmm.
My question is actually different, though. Where do you see personal responsibility in your use? Is it the flower or is it the dirt? So I've tried to always live a life of, I'm responsible for me.
Yeah.
I can't behave in a particular way and then say, well, it's not my fault. My football coach taught me to be that way.
Right.
I still have to own me.
Right.
And so in the soil or in the flowers?
Right. I think it's both and, right? So I think we all take responsibility for the communities that we create, whether it's the classroom community you create and the culture you create in that as a professor, whether it's the program culture that you create, whether it's the community that you create in a department or an institution, or your larger community. And then that has a ripple effect out. And so while it may start with an individual, I think that and I think what that doesn't happen though is, let's say it's your coach that's socializing you into this and calling you all types of names and using feminine descriptions as disparaging comments about your athletic prowess or something like that. Then if you don't stand up, see, it's widely enough experience that we would all know that that's a common lived experience. But I think if you don't stand up against that, right, that's the personal choice that you make in that moment, and in that way you're allowing it to happen. So it's not that every man in this room is perpetuating and behaving in these types of ways, but the idea is that when we hold this up as a standard and we hold this up as something that we revere and we think is the tough guy and that everybody wants to be in that way, then we're not challenging it. We're not dismantling that and saying, no, I'm not going to accept that. I'm not going to condone that. I'm not going to endorse that. And so, when it comes to the individual, I think that's where the responsibility lies. Tony.
Mike, great job on the presentation. Thank you for bringing this.
Yeah, thank you.
Tony Hill, School of Social Work. The question I have is, you asked the question, what does it mean to be a male? I think also I asked, what does it mean to be a female?
Yeah.
I just want to ask you questions about social media. So personally, I think that being a kid nowadays is very, very tough. So if you can talk about, number one, how do you work with parents to socialize their children?
Yeah.
Not only males, what does it mean to be a male, but also what does it mean to be a female?
Right. I'll start out by saying I don't know. My children are very young. So my oldest is 8, and I have a 4-year-old, and then so 2 boys, and then a daughter who's just 5 months old. So those are challenges and things that I'm not looking forward to navigating and figuring out. And it's just not an area that I know much about. I know that there's a lot of parental controls that people try and put on, that they try and be somebody's friend on Facebook or on Instagram so they can see what they're doing. But kids are savvy enough; they just create a new account. There's my parent account. There's my friend account. And it probably just comes with talks at home and setting that example. I mean, I think that's something that I think about for my boys, is how do I model that, and how do I live up to those ideals that are important to me. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons that this work has become more important to me, because my oldest is that sensitive, art-like, long-haired kid that I was, and I know how that hurts, and so I don't want him to go through that as well.
I just wanted to add on to that. I have a young child too,
Yeah.
and I've been thinking about this a lot. And there's 2 trends I've known among that I just see with parents that seem to come out of this like benign place that seems very damaging. Is this desperate want to share our beloved stories with our young children, and so I see again and again and again parents sharing terrifying stories of superheroes with very, very young children. My nephew, at 5 years old, his reward for being good in kindergarten was to go learn about Star Wars, and he was terrified. And it's changed his personality from playing butterflies
Yeah.
and having a baby doll
Yeah.
to being a stormtrooper.
Right.
And the other thing, I just had the conversation with a group of parents who were saying, I don't think my children started watching these violent movies and they're all having nightmares, but I'm making them, not letting them, but I'm forcing them, crying, to watch these movies, because if they don't, they won't fit in at school, and I don't want them to be social outcasts.
Yeah.
These are like really thoughtful parents.
Yeah.
So they're like struggling with
Yeah.
I don't want my kid to be left out of violent culture.
Yeah.
Because they'll be so sad and they'll be outcasts.
Yeah.
Like,
And I do. I mean, when I think about when I look back on that and I say, certainly I don't want my children to do what I did, mainly as a parent, because that would be a lot of anxiety and worry, and I know that I put my parents through. And I think about who I was at that time, and I think that I lacked integrity, right? And I don't know, exactly how we foster that in children, but I think it is something of, some centralized place of ego and belief in oneself and acceptance of oneself as we are, and whether that's within a family culture, that's within a friend culture, I think those are ways that we can have a both and, the kids can make choices for themselves and feel supported in that and feel that they know who they are in those moments. Walter.
Walter Mullen from the School of Social Work. I want to thank you for the presentation, but mostly for the way that you ended the presentation, because I felt like the shift in paradigm that you brought us through is really helpful to me.
Yeah.
So that we all can begin to shift our mind just from the experience
Yeah.
of doing that.
Thank you, Walter. Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Stephanie.
Hey, Stephanie.
Education. What would you say for someone who wants to learn more? What would be, I guess, a person work to look at? A
Yeah.
particular writing, a long
Right,
piece,
right,
a
right.
short piece? Where would someone go?
Well, next Tuesday, Jackson Katz will be speaking at UMass Amherst who I would say is kind of the leader in talking about masculinity, and especially media and masculinity. He has 2 films out. It's the variety of the similar one, but Tough Guys 2 is one that you can get through educational websites. It's a great film. But if you have Netflix, the more easily accessible one is The Mask We Live In, Mask I Live In, The Mask You Live In. Okay, one of those. Which is part of the Representation Project. So it's also the same documentarians that brought Misrepresentation. So those are their 2 parallel films. And so this one is on masculinity, and I think it does a great job. And there's many people that it brings up from there. Chris Kilmartin is another scholar who works in this field. Yeah, and probably others. But I think that's a good place to start, yeah. Lisa? Mm.
17-year-old self?
Yeah, that's like as a counseling psychologist, that's like a thing I often use in these kind of sessions. If you had to go back, because then you can give that advice to yourself now. I think I don't know. I mean, and I think I've thought about that a lot of times. I think I might, say something. Is this that you're good the way you are? That the more that you're you, the more people will accept you in the long run. You have to go, that you have to go through some of this taunts and this behavior, and no matter who you are or what you do, that's always going to be there. And so the more that you accept yourself and believe in the things that you love and follow those passions, then the happier you'll be. I think that's what I'd say.
I'm Charlene. I'm also with the School of Social Work. Thank you so much for being here on campus and hopefully being a steady place for folks to touch base and check in.
Yeah.
And I think the male voice is really, really important. And one of the things it reminds me of is that it is, in a way, your privilege is that you can convey to us a message that, as a man, in a way that is a little bit more gently received than received. And when women are trying to send the very same message. And so in thinking about the comment around Brett Kavanaugh and then the let's not suggest he did it, there's some thoughts that maybe he's saying he didn't. As a woman and in a request for folks to hear my voice and the collective voice, there are 4 women actually accusing him. And all we're really asking for is an investigation.
Yep.
Take a look at this before nominating someone with a lifetime appointment. Women across the country are watching in terror for our lives. And we need to actually have that be heard and respected instead of dismissed. And so I just want to kind of put that out there, that both voices need to be heard if we're really going to actually change some of these ones.
Yeah, thank you. Chris.
Chris Hackle, Center for Excellence in Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship. Thanks, Mike. That was great. I really appreciate the conversation around this topic. And you brought up the point of the students who might have that sign in there.
People all know Scarface, right? I was like, I don't know if this is culturally relevant anymore, but when I searched like Google Images for college room posters, that was still one of the most popular. All right.
My roommate.
You had it, yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. It wasn't me. It wasn't me. Yeah, it wasn't me. Yeah.
But I guess my question is, and a little bit of advice is, how do you, as an educator, help to bring this to awareness in the classroom without it being the mission of the class? So the modeling of this kind of approach or this understanding. So that students begin to at least consider their behavior. So essentially, how could an instructor help you sort of see this? Because as you know, as a psychologist,
it's everything. Yeah.
It's really deep in us.
Yeah.
And it's hard. So.
Yeah. I mean, I can only speak from what I teach, which is already, this is everything, right? That's most of what touches on all the things that we talk about. And so in counseling psychology, this is a big part of our conversation, issues of diversity and looking through that lens and challenging a lot of the work. But I guess I can't really think of a subject where it maybe math or something, I don't know. But even when I teach statistics and I talk about the types of research that are out there, I talk about, is this critical research? Is it working from a place and a standpoint that says something that promotes social equity, or is it establishing and reestablishing a status quo? And so, every researcher starts with a question, and that question is always informed by some bias. And so that's always where we need to kind of check in those areas. I think other courses, it lends itself more easily. I think teaching, courses where it's been a challenge for me to incorporate that, and now not a challenge because I've gotten more comfortable with it, is things like assessment. So when we talk about cognitive assessment or personality assessment, how those, assessment instruments are used, what they're used for, the power that's inherent within those results, the bias that's inherent within those as well. And that's not just across gender, but across racial and ethnic representations and social class, et cetera. So. All right. Well, thank you all for your thoughtful questions.
You indeed set the bar high. So for our 3 Pride Talk speakers coming up, I think we have now the opportunity to see where we go from here. If you are interested in participating in a Pride Talk next academic year, we'll have a call for speakers go out probably in February or so. We hope and encourage you to do so. Everyone has a story, and that's what these Pride Talks are meant to do. Sharing stories that are about relevance, and in today's day and age, this conversation is indeed relevant. So thank you so much. And if you would like to see it, it will be posted at some point in time within the next week or so on the Inclusion Community Engagement webpage for those that would like to go back and recap and just sort of kind of pull that nugget from and or to use it for other teaching mechanisms. So thank you so much.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.